So, yeah, as you can see, my x is an x, as in the experiment. And when I talk about experiment, I don't mean let's be experimental in the sense let's just try something. I mean actually the opposite. I mean experiment in the more narrow scientific sense. You can see here a textbook definition, but what matters, I'm not going to read this, what matters about this is that what we're doing when we're doing an experiment is that we are trying to create a situation which we control as researchers. We create an artificial situation on which we have control. This is something that most sociologists don't really like. They don't like it because they think controlling people is artificial, right? They think that manipulating people in a controlled environment is unfair. And they also think that the results of experiments don't really tell us something about the social world out there, they just tell us something about the experiment. That may be true, and I guess it is true in a lot of cases, but we still may want to do some experiments for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it allows us to bring in a certain playfulness into research. It allows us, precisely because the situation is artificial, to create situations about which we can find out something which we can't outside of that artificial situation. And it allows us to research topics which cannot be researched by other means and with other methods. And I want to show you one example of this. So what could be such a research topic that we cannot research with other methods? In one experiment that I did with some colleagues, it's future disasters. So these are disasters that haven't happened. We cannot do an ethnography of something that hasn't happened yet. We cannot interview people who have experienced something that hasn't happened yet, right? So this is why we want to do an experiment and create a situation where this can happen. So in our experiment, we tried to make people like you and me design scenarios for future yet unknown disasters and create emergency provisions for these disasters. Our idea was that these disasters should be inclusive, i.e. anybody should be able to create them. They should be non-restrictive in the sense of what they can simulate. They could be very large, very small, planetary, or just happening in your household. And they should provide new disaster scenarios, not in scenarios that we already know, like earthquakes and so on and so forth, but things that we didn't think of. This is also the problem that, for example, the English state is trying to do, and this is where our project had its starting point, namely existing ways of dealing with this problem, and this is happening usually with experts sitting in a room and looking at data of past disasters and thinking from there into future ones. But we would like to take this away or add to this method another method which allows anybody to do this. How did we do this? We created a sandbox. You can see it here. We brought in some quite abstract figures that look quite unlike the things that you know in your world, and that's really important here, the abstractness of these figures. And then we first asked people, without telling them that our experiment is about creating disasters, that they should create the world, using these figures. Once they built this world, we asked them to let a disaster happen in that world, turn that world upside down. And in the third step, we asked them to introduce an emergency provision that would have changed that disaster to the better. You can see here one photograph of one of these disasters. I don't have the time now to go into the details because this took each time about 45 minutes or an hour, and we did about 100 of these with various kinds of people. But you can see that the results are quite different from what state disaster experts find out. For example, one scenario would be that the magnetic field stops of the Earth. One would be a complete dissimulation of the future. That is how it was called by the person doing it. It was an egoistic drive for wealth taking over. A very personal one here, for example, somebody just went bust. or a complete transformation of elements where every element in the world was turned into something else. What you can see from these examples, and these are just 5 from 100, is that some of them are very small, some of them are very big, some of them are spiritual, some of them have a very indeterminate course of action, and very often, and this is quite different from what these state experts are doing, they don't involve the state in any important way. Now, how is this sociological, you may ask? First of all, it creates data about a future society that we don't know yet. And as I said, this is very difficult to create with other methods. Second, and this is very typical for sociology, it doesn't create one version, it creates many different versions, and we can analyze these different versions according to who did it. And lastly, it produces data which are from a qualitative form, right? There are a lot of other disciplines that produce data about future states of society, such as demographics or economics, but these are usually extrapolations of past data into the future. This is quite different because it's a form, it's a social form that emerges that we didn't know. And finally, we couldn't have done this without doing an experiment. And that's it. Thank you.